The moment you realize you're being judged in less than 3 seconds, everything after that becomes a test of silence. Ava Johnson stepped through the glass doors of Luxline Auto Gallery in downtown Chicago just after 10:17 a.m., the kind of place where polished marble floors reflected the ceiling lights like they were trying to prove something. She wore a simple black coat, no visible branding, no entourage, nothing that would signal what she actually was. To anyone watching, she looked like a visitor who had taken a wrong turn into a world built to intimidate people like her. Behind the front desk, Emily Carter lifted her eyes from a tablet and paused just long enough for judgment to form. She had seen hundreds of customers walk through those doors, but something about Ava made her hesitate, not out of respect, but calculation. Richard Blake, the showroom manager, stood nearby with his arms folded, already observing her like a question waiting for the wrong answer. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, but the tone wasn't an invitation, it was a filter. Ava didn't rush, didn't smile to soften the moment. She simply replied that she wanted to see the top-tier electric models, the newest release in the executive line. Emily's eyes flicked once toward Richard, and in that silent exchange a decision was already made. "People like that don't usually start at the top," Richard muttered under his breath, not caring if it was heard. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The showroom itself seemed to absorb them, as if the space was designed to amplify doubt and disguise it as protocol. Ava walked forward anyway, her steps steady against the polished floor, passing vehicles worth more than most homes without slowing down, as if she had every right to be there. But entitlement is often confused with belonging, and in places like this, belonging was something you had to prove twice. Emily gestured toward a display area but didn't follow. Instead, she called over James Miller from security with a subtle nod that didn't need explanation. James positioned himself near the entrance, not blocking, just reminding. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks, a junior systems analyst, working on site for internal diagnostics, glanced up from his tablet and frowned as he scanned a backend access feed that didn't match the assumptions forming in the room. He hesitated, then started typing again, slower this time, as if the system itself was contradicting what he was seeing in front of him. Ava stopped near a matte black sedan under soft lighting and placed her hand lightly on the edge of the display stand, not as a customer admiring a product, but as someone measuring something far more invisible. Richard stepped closer now, his patience thinning, asking if she understood the price range before her, implying she might be wasting time she couldn't afford to spend. Ava finally looked at him, not with anger, not with defense, but with the kind of quiet certainty that makes people uncomfortable without knowing why. "I understand more than you think," she said simply, and for a brief moment the room didn't know how to respond. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion, but from the beginning of something nobody in the room was prepared to name. And somewhere deep in the system logs, Daniel was still staring at a line of data that had just changed without permission, a line that carried a name everyone in the showroom had just underestimated without realizing the cost of that mistake was already in motion. The air inside the showroom began to change in ways no one could immediately explain, not because something loud had happened, but because small things were starting to feel misaligned, as if reality itself had shifted a fraction out of place. Emily Carter returned to her screen, but her attention kept drifting back to Ava Johnson, who still stood near the display vehicle with a calm that did not match how she was being treated. Richard Blake adjusted his stance, folding his arms tighter, a subtle attempt to reassert control over a situation he believed he understood. "We have clients by appointment only for that section," Emily said, her voice now more precise, more formal, as if structure could replace uncertainty. Ava turned slightly, acknowledging the statement without resistance, then asked a simple question about the specifications of the top-tier configuration, her tone steady, unbothered, almost as if the previous comment had never been made. That calm unsettled Emily more than any argument could have, because it refused to participate in the hierarchy they were enforcing. James Miller, positioned near the entrance, shifted his weight and glanced toward Richard, waiting for a signal that never fully came, because even Richard was beginning to sense that something about this interaction did not fit the usual pattern. In the back office, Daniel Brooks leaned closer to his terminal as lines of internal data refreshed again, slower this time. then abruptly corrected themselves without manual input. He frowned, then pulled up the ownership verification layer, expecting routine results, but instead found a partial access flag linked to a corporate structure far above showroom level. He hesitated, cursor hovering, as if acknowledging it out loud might trigger consequences he could not yet define. "Richard," Emily called softly, stepping closer to the manager. "Should we ask her to wait in the consultation area?" It was phrased like a suggestion, but it functioned like an escalation. Richard nodded without looking away from Ava, then took a step forward and spoke with rehearsed confidence, explaining that high-tier inventory required prior validation and financial pre-screening, a statement designed to sound procedural but landing with the weight of exclusion. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and when he finished, she simply asked if that policy applied to all visitors or only those without recognition in the system. The question was not loud, but it cut through the room in a way that made Emily pause mid-movement. Daniel's screen flickered again, and this time he saw a status line update tied to an executive-level registry refresh, something that should not have been triggered from a showroom floor interaction. His breathing slowed as he realized the system was not reacting to what was being said, but to who was standing inside the building. James adjusted his posture again, now less certain, as if the room itself had become heavier without changing shape. Ava walked a few steps closer to the vehicle, placing herself directly beneath the overhead light, and for the first time Richard noticed something unsettling not about her appearance, but about her certainty, as if she was not entering a space to be accepted, but returning to one that already belonged to her in ways no one else had been told. And somewhere behind the scenes, Daniel whispered to himself that the name appearing in the restricted ownership field was not just active, it was updating in real time, as though the system was waiting for something the room had not yet realized was already happening. The showroom no longer felt like a simple retail space. It now carried a tension that neither glass walls nor polished lighting could conceal, as if every reflection had started to observe the people inside, instead of simply mirroring them. Ava Johnson remained near the vehicle display, her presence still quiet, but the silence around her was no longer neutral, it was reactive, almost defensive. Emily Carter glanced at Richard Blake again, waiting for him to reinforce the structure of control they were supposed to represent. But Richard's confidence had begun to fracture in subtle ways, visible only in the hesitation between his movements and his words. "We are simply following verification procedures," he said, though his tone carried less certainty than before, as if he was reminding himself more than anyone else. Ava turned slightly toward him and asked if verification applied equally regardless of how a person was perceived upon entry, her voice steady, not challenging, but observing. The question lingered longer than expected, and no one answered immediately, because answering would have required acknowledging something the room was not ready to confront. Emily shifted her gaze toward James Miller, expecting him to maintain presence at the entrance. But even James had adjusted his stance, now less like a barrier and more like a witness uncertain of what he was guarding against. In the back office, Daniel Brooks was now fully focused on his terminal, where the internal registry continued to refresh in irregular intervals, each update confirming a higher-level access tag that should not have been visible through standard showroom permissions. He leaned closer, reading the line repeatedly, as if repetition might change its meaning, but it did not. The system was not glitching, it was aligning. Richard stepped closer to Ava again, attempting to regain authority through proximity, asking whether she had an appointment under a corporate liaison, a question designed to redirect her away from the main inventory floor. Ava did not immediately respond. Instead, she looked past him toward the vehicles, then back to the room, as if evaluating not the question, but the structure that produced it. "This location is reserved for qualified buyers," Emily added, her voice now carrying a sharper edge, the kind that appears when uncertainty is masked as enforcement. Ava finally nodded once, acknowledging the statement, and asked what qualified meant in a system where access seemed to depend more on perception than confirmation. That question shifted the atmosphere again, not loudly, but decisively, because it exposed a contradiction that no one had prepared to defend. Daniel's screen then triggered another update, this time accompanied by a system notification that paused all manual overrides, a rare condition reserved for ownership transition protocols. His eyes widened slightly as he read the line confirming that the showroom's operational registry was currently under external verification authority. He whispered that something was not right, but no one heard him clearly over the silence that had begun to spread across the floor. James looked toward Richard, waiting for instruction, but Richard no longer gave immediate commands. Instead, he stared at Ava with a new kind of attention, as if trying to recalibrate his understanding of what kind of visitor does not behave like a visitor at all. Ava stepped forward one more time, stopping directly under the central lighting of the showroom, and asked if anyone present had access to the latest ownership ledger update. Her tone unchanged, calm and factual, but now carrying the weight of inevitability. And in the back office, Daniel finally saw the confirmation line complete its refresh cycle, locking into place a name that matched the woman standing in the center of the showroom, while the system quietly shifted its status from verification pending to ownership synchronization active. The silence inside the showroom had shifted into something heavier, no longer just uncertainty, but recognition forming in fragments, like pieces of a picture slowly aligning in the minds of everyone present without them fully understanding what they were seeing. Ava Johnson remained at the center of the space beneath the overhead lighting, her posture unchanged, but the energy around her had begun to subtly reverse direction, as if the room itself was recalculating its assumptions. Emily Carter stood frozen for a moment longer than she realized, her eyes moving between Ava and Richard Blake, searching for the familiar authority cues that usually told her how to act, but none of them were responding the way they used to. Richard finally spoke again, his voice lower now, less structured, asking if there might be some confusion in the system records, a phrase that sounded like control but carried the weight of doubt. Ava tilted her head slightly and asked if confusion was possible in a verified ownership ledger, her tone still calm, but now precise enough to make the question feel like a reflection rather than a challenge. Behind the scenes, Daniel Brooks stared at his screen as the system completed another synchronization cycle, this time locking out manual override access across all showroom terminals, replacing it with a read-only verification state that displayed a single active ownership profile tied directly to the corporate parent registry. He leaned back slightly, his expression tightening as he realized this was no longer a local system issue, but a structural update originating from the highest administrative level. His cursor hovered over the name displayed on the screen, then moved slowly back to the live showroom feed, where Ava stood in perfect alignment with the record. James Miller, still positioned near the entrance, adjusted his stance again, but now it was no longer about control or enforcement, it was about observation, as if he had become aware that his role in the room had quietly changed without instruction. Emily finally broke her silence, asking Ava if she had authorization documentation available, her voice attempting to restore procedural hierarchy, but the question now sounded delayed, as if it belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. Ava responded by asking if authorization was still required when the system itself had already confirmed ownership, and for the first time no one immediately countered her statement. Richard stepped back half a step without realizing it, his eyes briefly flicking toward the central display terminal that had now refreshed to show restricted administrative access granted. Daniel's breathing slowed as he opened the internal audit trail, where timestamps showed that ownership verification had been triggered from an external executive channel only accessible through board-level clearance. He whispered the confirmation to himself, reading the same line repeatedly, as if repetition could soften the implication, but it did not. The showroom floor felt different now, not louder or more chaotic, but structurally unstable in a way that came from certainty collapsing rather than conflict escalating. Emily looked toward Richard again, but this time she did not receive direction, only hesitation. And in that hesitation, she understood something had already shifted beyond their ability to correct. Ava took one slow step forward, not toward any person, but toward the center of the showroom space itself, as if acknowledging a position that had always been hers in the system, even if it had never been recognized in the room. And in the back office, Daniel finally saw the final update complete, where the ownership field stabilized into a permanent active status under Ava Johnson's name, while every connected terminal simultaneously switched from verification mode to compliance acknowledgement. silently confirming that the hierarchy everyone had been acting under no longer applied. The moment the showroom systems confirmed ownership status, the atmosphere did not explode, it simply changed state, like air pressure shifting in a sealed room where everyone suddenly realizes they are no longer in control of the environment. Ava Johnson remained still at the center of the space, but now every small movement around her carried a different meaning, as if the room was reinterpreting her presence in real time. Emily Carter's eyes stayed fixed on the nearest terminal, watching as the interface she had used for years replaced standard access menus with a simplified administrative layer that displayed only one active authority profile. Richard Blake did not speak immediately, and when he finally did, his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier, asking in a careful tone whether the system might still be updating or if there was a delay in synchronization. Daniel Brooks, still in the back office, leaned closer to his screen, confirming what he already knew but still struggling to accept, as the audit trail continued to refresh in real time, locking every prior assumption into irreversible history. The name displayed under ownership authority was now fully verified, and every connected subsystem reflected the same conclusion without exception or error. James Miller, standing near the entrance, slowly lowered his posture, no longer acting as a barrier but instead as someone waiting for instruction that no longer needed to be given. Emily finally stepped forward half a pace, her voice quieter now, asking Ava if she had been aware of the system status before entering the showroom. But the question carried uncertainty rather than challenge. Ava looked at her and asked whether awareness was ever the requirement, or whether recognition was simply delayed until systems were forced to reflect what was already true. The question did not receive an immediate response, because the structure of the room no longer supported the assumptions behind it. Richard glanced at the central display again, where administrative control indicators had fully transitioned into ownership acknowledgement mode, removing all previous managerial privileges from active use. Daniel's screen in the back office confirmed the same shift, showing a final synchronization timestamp and a locked audit state indicating permanent record update, meaning no reversal or override was possible without executive board authorization. He exhaled slowly, realizing that what had seemed like a routine showroom interaction had actually triggered a corporate-level transition event, something designed to activate only under verified ownership identity presence. The realization made him sit back slightly, his hands no longer moving, as if the system itself had removed the need for further action. On the showroom floor, Ava took another step forward, not toward any individual, but into the center line of the space where decisions were usually made about who belonged and who did not. Emily instinctively stepped aside without fully understanding why she was doing it, and that movement was followed by a subtle shift in everyone else's positioning, as if the room had collectively acknowledged a new center of gravity. Richard finally lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition that the framework he had been operating under no longer applied to the reality in front of him. And in that quiet structural collapse of assumption, the system completed its final confirmation cycle, leaving no ambiguity, only alignment, as every interface across the showroom displayed the same unchanged truth of ownership, now fully assigned and actively enforced. The showroom no longer resembled the environment it had been at the beginning of the day, not in its physical structure, but in the way every person inside it now seemed to occupy a different psychological position within the same space. Ava Johnson stood at the center with a stillness that no longer felt passive, but established, as if the room itself had reorganized its attention around her without requiring permission. Emily Carter remained near the nearest display terminal, her eyes fixed on the updated system interface that now displayed a single confirmed ownership authority, removing all prior ambiguity from the showroom hierarchy. Richard Blake, who had spent the earlier part of the interaction attempting to stabilize control through procedure and tone, now appeared to be recalibrating his understanding of the situation itself, his voice absent for several moments as he processed what the system confirmation actually meant in practical terms. Daniel Brooks, still in the back office, watched as the final audit confirmation locked into place, sealing the ownership transition in a way that could not be reverted through local access or managerial override. The system log displayed a corporate-level validation stamp, indicating that the change had been executed directly through executive authorization channels that bypassed all intermediate approval layers. He leaned forward slightly, reading the same line repeatedly, not because it was unclear, but because it contradicted every assumption he had been operating under since the moment Ava entered the building. On the showroom floor, James Miller, who had been positioned as security presence, no longer maintained the same posture. His stance softened not from instruction, but from realization that the function he had been performing was no longer aligned with the updated authority structure. Emily finally spoke again, her voice careful and measured, asking Ava if she intended to proceed with any immediate operational changes to the showroom environment, a question that reflected a shift from enforcement to acknowledgement. Ava looked at her for a brief moment and asked instead whether operations had ever truly been independent, or whether they had simply been following a hierarchy that was never questioned until it was directly replaced. The question hung in the air without resistance, because resistance required a framework that was no longer active. Richard turned slightly toward the central display again, where all administrative privileges had been replaced with a single line indicating ownership synchronization complete, followed by a status confirming full system integration under Ava Johnson's authority profile. In the back office, Daniel noticed a secondary update trigger initiate automatically, propagating across all connected showroom systems, from inventory access to sales permissions, each one recalibrating its access rules in real time to match the new ownership structure. The transition was silent, but absolute, removing all previous managerial hierarchy layers without any need for manual confirmation. James slowly shifted his position closer to the side of the showroom, not stepping forward or backward, but simply adjusting to a reality where instructions were no longer issued from the roles he had been trained to recognize. Emily lowered her gaze briefly to her terminal, where her access level had changed from administrative control to observational access only, a detail that confirmed she no longer had authority over the system she had been operating moments earlier. Ava took a single step forward, not assertive, not hesitant, but deliberate in a way that suggested the space itself was now responding to her presence rather than defining it. Richard finally spoke again, but this time his words were not procedural, they were reflective, acknowledging that the structure they had relied on had already been replaced before they were aware it was vulnerable. And as the final system confirmation completed across every terminal in the showroom, the environment settled into a new equilibrium, where every display, every access point, and every operational layer now reflected a single uninterrupted truth of ownership fully established and actively governing the space. The transition inside the showroom had fully completed, yet the feeling it left behind was not stability, but recalibration, as if every person inside the space was still adjusting to a new version of reality that had already replaced the previous one without warning. Ava Johnson stood in the center of the showroom floor, no longer perceived as a visitor, but as the fixed reference point around which every system, every gaze, and every silence now organized itself. Emily Carter remained near her terminal, her hands still, her eyes moving slowly across the updated interface that no longer asked for approval but only displayed confirmation of ownership authority. Richard Blake, who had once carried himself with procedural certainty, now stood in a quieter posture, his attention no longer directed at control, but at understanding the implications of what control had just become. Daniel Brooks in the back office continued to monitor the system logs, where every subsystem had now fully synchronized under a single administrative identity, removing layered permissions and replacing them with unified executive governance that extended across inventory, access, and operational oversight. He exhaled slowly, realizing that what he was observing was not an isolated correction, but a complete structural redefinition of authority within the organization. On the showroom floor, James Miller no longer positioned himself as security presence, instead standing in a neutral stance that reflected a shift from enforcement to acknowledgement, as if the role itself had dissolved into observation. Emily finally spoke again, her voice softer than before, asking Ava if she intended to make any immediate changes to staffing or showroom operations, a question that now carried a different weight, because it assumed authority had to be exercised rather than simply recognized. Ava turned slightly toward her, and asked whether change was necessary when the system had already aligned itself without resistance, her tone steady, precise, and devoid of urgency. The question did not invite argument, because argument required competing authority, and that no longer existed within the room's operational structure. Richard glanced once more at the central display, where ownership confirmation remained permanently active, marked with a status indicator that signaled full integration across all connected corporate systems. In the back office, Daniel watched as secondary access logs began to refresh automatically, updating vendor permissions, sales clearance levels, and internal approval hierarchies, all recalibrating to reflect a single governing authority profile without manual intervention. The system was no longer negotiating change. It had already completed it. James shifted slightly again, not toward anyone, but toward a position that reflected awareness rather than instruction, as if he understood that presence itself now meant something different than it had minutes earlier. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, noticing that her terminal no longer displayed management tools, only read access and compliance acknowledgement fields, confirming the irreversible shift in her operational role. Ava took another step forward, not toward confrontation, but through the center of the space as though traversing something that had always been structured around her without being permitted to recognize it. Richard finally spoke again, but his words were no longer about procedure or verification, instead acknowledging that the framework they had depended on had not failed in real time. It had simply never included the full scope of truth that was now visible. And as the final wave of system updates completed across every interface, the showroom settled into a unified state where every terminal, every access layer, and every operational function now reflected a single confirmed reality of ownership fully established and continuously enforced. The showroom did not return to normal because there was no normal state left to return to, only a newly established order that had already overwritten the assumptions everyone had carried into the space. Ava Johnson remained at the center of it, no longer observed as a potential customer, but as the confirmed authority around which every system, display, and access point had reorganized itself. Emily Carter stood near her terminal, her expression fixed on the unchanged confirmation screen that now defined ownership as active, continuous, and non-negotiable, with no pathway for reversal or reinterpretation. Richard Blake, who had once attempted to guide the interaction through procedural certainty, now stood in silence that carried the weight of recognition, understanding that the framework he relied on had not been challenged, but completely replaced at a level beneath his authority to respond. In the back office, Daniel Brooks continued monitoring the cascading system updates, watching as every remaining subsystem completed synchronization, from inventory authorization layers to client verification protocols, each one aligning under a single executive identity that required no approval because it was the source of approval itself. He leaned back slightly, hands no longer moving, as the final audit logs confirmed permanent status change, locking the showroom into a unified governance state that could not be manually separated into prior roles or permissions. On the floor, James Miller stood without direction, no longer functioning as enforcement or barrier, but as a witness to an environment where enforcement had lost its reference point entirely. Emily finally spoke again, her voice quiet, asking Ava if any transitional instructions would be issued for staff or operations, but the question no longer carried urgency, only an attempt to reattach meaning to a structure that had already been rewritten. Ava looked toward her briefly and asked whether instructions were necessary when the system had already completed alignment on its own, her tone calm, as if describing something inevitable rather than executed. The question remained unanswered because there was no procedural framework left to respond within. Richard shifted his attention once more toward the central display, where ownership confirmation remained permanently active, accompanied by a continuous audit signal indicating full integration across all operational channels. In the back office, Daniel observed the final layer of system reconciliation complete, where external vendor access, internal scheduling, and administrative permissions all collapsed into a single unified authority structure without conflict or exception. The transition was not marked by disruption, but by finality, as if the system had resolved a question that no one inside the room had realized was already being asked. James subtly adjusted his position again, no longer aligning himself with any role-based expectation, but simply existing within a space that now defined him differently than before. Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, recognizing that her access had been permanently reduced to observational status, confirming that the hierarchy she had operated under no longer existed in functional form. Ava took one final step forward through the center of the showroom, not as an act of arrival, but as confirmation of presence within a system that had already acknowledged her as its defining authority. And as the last synchronization cycle completed across every connected terminal, the showroom stabilized into a single continuous state of ownership and control, where every interface, every record, and every operational layer reflected one uninterrupted truth that had fully replaced the world they had entered with. The showroom had reached a state where nothing external seemed capable of altering it anymore, not because it was frozen, but because every layer of its structure had already been resolved into a single continuous confirmation of ownership and authority. Ava Johnson stood at the center of that structure, no longer perceived through the lens of suspicion or evaluation, but through the quiet recognition that had replaced all prior interpretations of her presence. Emily Carter remained near her terminal, now only observing the final system state, where access privileges, operational controls, and administrative layers had all converged into a unified profile that no longer required interpretation or validation. Richard Blake stood slightly apart from where he had been earlier, his posture no longer shaped by authority, but by acknowledgement, as if the space itself had removed the need for resistance or assertion. In the back office, Daniel Brooks watched the final reconciliation logs complete their cycle, confirming that every subsystem across the showroom network had fully synchronized under a single governing identity, locking the environment into permanent alignment without pending exceptions or unresolved conflicts. The system no longer displayed transitional states, only completed structure, where ownership, control, and access existed as one continuous condition rather than separate functions. James Miller remained near the entrance, no longer positioned as enforcement, but as presence within a space that no longer required enforcement to define boundaries. Emily finally spoke in a low, steady tone, asking Ava if any final operational directives would be issued, but the question carried no urgency, only the instinct of an earlier system trying to recognize itself in a framework that no longer existed. Ava looked at her briefly and asked whether directives were meaningful in a structure that had already completed its own alignment, her voice calm and unchanged, as if describing the natural conclusion of a process rather than a disruption. The question settled without response, not because it was ignored, but because there was no remaining hierarchy through which it could be processed. Richard turned his attention once more to the central interface, where ownership confirmation remained active without fluctuation, signaling continuous authority across all operational layers of the showroom and its connected systems. In the back office, Daniel observed the final log entry appear, marking the completion of global synchronization across all access points, vendor permissions, and internal management protocols, each one now permanently tied to a single verified authority profile, without the possibility of fragmentation or reversal under standard administrative control. He realized that what had unfolded was not a correction or update, but a full structural replacement of assumed governance, executed seamlessly at the system level before human recognition had fully caught up. James subtly adjusted his stance once more, no longer reflecting uncertainty or enforcement, but quiet recognition that his role had been redefined without instruction or conflict. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, acknowledging through the interface that her access had been permanently reduced to observational status, confirming the complete transition of authority beyond her operational reach. Ava took one final step forward through the center of the showroom, not as an act of arrival or departure, but as confirmation that the space had already completed its recalibration around her presence. And as the final system state locked into continuous confirmation across every terminal, display, and administrative layer, the showroom settled into a permanent condition of unified control, where every function, every record,